I still remember the exact moment I realized silence can sound louder than words ever could, and it started on a Tuesday morning when nothing seemed wrong but everything already was. My name is Ethan Walker, and I used to believe that marriage changes over time in predictable ways, that love settles into routines, quieter maybe, but still solid underneath the surface. Yet what I didn't understand back then was that sometimes quiet isn't peace at all, it's distance growing in real time. Jessica and I had been married for 7 years, living in a modest 2-bedroom house just outside of Denver, the kind of place with a small front yard, a mailbox slightly tilted from years of weather, and a driveway just wide enough for one car and occasional misunderstandings that never got fully resolved. We used to share everything without thinking about it: morning coffee on the kitchen counter, late-night TV shows we barely paid attention to, and conversations that didn't need effort because they just happened naturally. But over the last few months something had shifted in ways I couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't dramatic at first, nothing you could point to and accuse, just small absences that started adding up like weight you don't notice until your shoulders begin to hurt. She started leaving earlier for work even though her schedule hadn't changed, coming home later with explanations that felt shorter every time, and her phone became something she guarded without saying she was guarding it, always face down, always close enough that I could see it but never touch it. I told myself it was nothing because that's what people do when they want life to stay familiar. They explain away discomfort until it becomes background noise. That morning, I was standing in the kitchen holding a half-empty mug of coffee when I realized I hadn't heard her voice properly in over a day. Not a real conversation, not a shared moment, just fragments exchanged between tasks. She came down the stairs dressed in a light gray blouse and black slacks, hair still slightly damp like she had just rushed through getting ready, and she didn't look at me right away, not until she was already halfway to the door. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound normal, and she nodded like she heard me from another room. I asked if she wanted coffee. She paused for half a second too long and said, "I'm fine, I'm already running late," and then she was gone before I could ask anything else. The door closed softly, almost carefully, like even sound was being managed now. I stood there for a while longer than I should have, listening to the house settle back into itself, noticing how still everything felt without her presence in it, and I told myself again that nothing was wrong, that busy seasons happen, that adults drift a little and come back eventually, but somewhere deep down I knew I was already starting to count things that didn't add up. I did not realize at first how quickly uncertainty can start to reshape the way you see someone you have known for years, but by the time that afternoon arrived, I was already noticing patterns I could not ignore even if I wanted to. I tried to focus on work that day, answering emails from my laptop at the dining table, pretending that everything inside my home still operated on the same quiet rhythm it always had, but every small interruption felt heavier than usual. I checked my phone more times than I should have, not because I expected anything, but because I was beginning to feel like something was missing that I could not name. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to call Jessica again, telling myself it was just to hear her voice, just to confirm that everything was normal, but the call rang longer than expected before going unanswered. I sat there holding the phone slightly tighter than necessary, watching the screen as if it might explain itself. Then I placed it face down on the table and told myself she was probably in a meeting or driving somewhere without signal. I waited a few minutes, then tried again, slower this time, more deliberate, but the result was the same silence stretching through the line until it disconnected. That was when I first felt the subtle shift from curiosity to something sharper, something less willing to settle for easy explanations. A few moments later, my phone vibrated once on the table, breaking the quiet in a way that made my chest tighten without reason. I picked it up immediately, and there was a message from her, short and simple, saying she was busy. No explanation, no context, just those 2 words sitting on the screen like they were meant to end the conversation before it even began. I stared at it longer than I needed to, reading it again and again, trying to find tone or intention hidden somewhere between the letters, but there was nothing there except distance. I replied without thinking too long, my fingers moving before I could overanalyze what I was about to say, and what I sent was not emotional or dramatic, it was quiet and controlled, almost too calm even for me. After that, I placed the phone down again and leaned back in my chair, looking around the room as if something in it had changed while I was not paying attention. The house still looked the same, sunlight still came through the windows at the same angle, the air still carried the faint sound of the refrigerator running in the background, but everything felt slightly disconnected, like I was observing my own life instead of living inside it. I tried to return to my work, opening the same document I had been reading earlier, but the words no longer held my focus. Instead, I found myself replaying the last few weeks in my mind, searching for moments that now felt different in hindsight. Small delays, shortened conversations, the way she sometimes paused before answering simple questions, all of it starting to connect into something I was not ready to define yet. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen without a clear reason, then stopped halfway, realizing I was not looking for anything specific, just movement to break the stillness in my head. When I finally returned to the table, my phone remained face down exactly where I left it, silent and unchanged, but I no longer trusted that silence meant nothing was happening. I remember sitting there longer than I intended, not because anything new was happening, but because nothing was, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any explanation I could imagine. The house around me continued its normal rhythm, the faint hum of appliances, the distant sound of a passing car outside, the subtle creak of the floor as the temperature shifted, but none of it reached me in the same way anymore. I kept telling myself to return to work, to focus on something productive, anything that would pull my attention back into order, but my mind kept circling the same unanswered spaces. Jessica had always been consistent with communication, even on her busiest days, even when work ran late or plans changed unexpectedly, there was always context, always a sense of presence behind her words. What I was seeing now felt different, not loud or obvious, but restrained in a way that made it harder to dismiss. I picked up my phone again without fully deciding to, scrolling through our recent messages as if repetition might reveal something I had missed the first time. There was nothing unusual on the surface, no argument, no clear sign of distance, only shorter responses and increasing gaps between them, small changes that did not prove anything on their own but started to form a pattern I could not unsee. I placed the phone back down and walked into the kitchen again, this time slower, more aware of how empty the space felt without conversation filling it. The sunlight had shifted slightly across the counter, marking the passage of time in a way I had not noticed before, and I found myself thinking about how routine can disguise change until it becomes impossible to ignore. A notification sound broke the silence, sharp enough to pull me back instantly, and I reached for the phone before I even registered the impulse. It was not a call this time, just another message from Jessica, still brief, still detached, repeating the same explanation that she was busy. I read it once, then again, not because it changed, but because I was trying to hear something behind it that was not there. I typed a response and deleted it twice before finally sending something simple, controlled, almost neutral, because I did not yet know what question I was even trying to ask. After that, I set the phone down but did not look away from it, as if waiting for it to reveal something on its own. My attention drifted towards small details. In the room I normally never noticed, the alignment of chairs, the faint reflection of light on the countertop, the quiet ticking of something electrical I could not locate, and I realized how quickly observation turns into interpretation when certainty begins to fade. I told myself I was overthinking, that there was no reason to build meaning out of fragments, but even as I thought it, I understood I was already past the point of simple reassurance. I checked the time and noticed how much of the afternoon had passed without me really being present in it, and for the first time that day, I considered that the issue was not what I knew, but what I did not yet have enough information to explain. I was trying to convince myself that nothing had truly changed, that what I was feeling was just the natural anxiety of someone thinking too much into silence, but the more I sat with it, the more that explanation stopped feeling stable. I moved through the house without a clear purpose, not really doing anything, just existing in motion as if movement alone could reset my thoughts. Every room felt slightly different now, not because the space itself had changed, but because I was starting to see it through a different awareness, one that noticed absence more than presence. I paused in the hallway and realized how often I had been checking my phone without even intending to, a reflex that had developed in less than a day, as if I was waiting for something that I could not define. When I finally sat back down at the kitchen table, I placed my phone directly in front of me instead of beside me, watching it as if observation might somehow influence its behavior. The silence in the house was no longer comfortable or neutral, it had become active, like it was participating in the same uncertainty I was trying to ignore. I thought about Jessica again, not in dramatic terms, but in small fragments of memory, the way she used to describe her day in detail, the way she would sometimes call just to say something unimportant, the way her presence used to feel continuous rather than segmented into gaps. Those patterns no longer matched what I was experiencing now, and that mismatch was what kept pulling my attention back into doubt. I opened my phone again and scrolled through her location updates, something I had rarely ever felt the need to check before, and noticed that the last recorded movement placed her in an area that made sense for work, but not for the timing she had described earlier. It was not enough to prove anything, but it also was not nothing, and that space in between was becoming harder to ignore. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, trying to separate facts from interpretation, but even that distinction felt less clear than it used to. A few minutes passed without any new messages, and in that absence, my thoughts began to fill in possibilities I had not invited. I told myself to stop, to return to rational thinking, to trust what I knew rather than what I imagined, but trust was beginning to feel like something I was trying to force rather than something I naturally held. I stood up again, walked to the window, and looked outside at the quiet street, noticing how ordinary everything still appeared, how life continued without acknowledging the tension I was carrying inside. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized the problem was no longer about one unanswered call or one short message, it was about the accumulation of small inconsistencies that were slowly reshaping how I interpreted everything else, and I could not yet tell whether I was uncovering something real, or simply learning how uncertainty feels when it finally refuses to stay hidden. I kept telling myself that checking again would not change anything, but even that thought was becoming harder to trust, because by now my actions no longer felt fully intentional, more like reactions to something I could not yet see clearly. I returned to the kitchen and sat down again, placing my phone in front of me exactly where I could see it without having to reach for it, as if proximity alone would give me some sense of control. The house remained quiet, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet from earlier in the day. It felt denser now, as if every minute that passed without clarity added weight to the air around me. I opened Jessica's last message again, reading the same 2 words repeatedly, trying to detect tone that might explain context, but language that simple offered nothing to hold on to. I considered calling her again, not because I expected a different result, but because silence had started to feel more difficult to interpret than any possible answer. Before I acted on that impulse, I hesitated, noticing how quickly repetition was turning into habit, and how habit was starting to influence my sense of urgency. I stood up instead and walked through the living room, passing the couch where we used to sit together in the evenings, and I noticed how those routines now felt distant, almost detached from the present moment, like they belonged to a version of life that no longer matched what I was experiencing. I stopped near the window again and looked outside, focusing on small details that usually went unnoticed, like the slow movement of leaves in the wind and the steady rhythm of cars passing at a distance, and I realized how normal everything continued to look even while my internal sense of stability was shifting. My phone vibrated once, breaking the stillness sharply enough that I turned immediately toward it, and for a moment I felt a brief surge of expectation before I even knew what I was expecting. It was another message from Jessica, still brief, still unchanged in tone, repeating the same explanation that she was busy, and nothing more. I read it once, then again, then placed the phone down more slowly this time, noticing how my reaction had started to change from curiosity into something more measured, almost analytical. I was no longer responding emotionally in the same immediate way. Instead, I was observing my own response as if it belonged to someone else. I returned to the table and sat down, noticing how the surface of everything around me seemed unchanged, yet my interpretation of it was not. The light in the room had shifted slightly as the afternoon continued, casting longer shadows across the floor, and I found myself watching those changes with unusual attention, as if they might explain something I had not yet understood. I thought again about Jessica's pattern of communication, not as isolated moments, but as a sequence, and in that sequence I could feel something forming that I was not yet ready to define. There was still no clear proof of anything, no single moment that confirmed a conclusion, but the accumulation of small gaps, small absences, and small inconsistencies was beginning to shape a perspective that felt increasingly difficult to ignore, and for the first time that day, I stopped asking myself what I knew, and started wondering what I had been avoiding noticing. I stopped trying to force clarity out of the situation because every attempt to do so only seemed to make the uncertainty feel more structured, not less, as if I was organizing something that refused to be organized. Instead, I sat quietly at the kitchen table and let time pass without interfering with it, watching the room shift through small changes in light and sound while my phone remained still in front of me like an object that had stopped participating in the normal flow of communication. I noticed how often I was now focusing on silence itself rather than what might break it, and that realization made me more aware of how my attention had begun to narrow into specific patterns I did not consciously choose. There was a moment where I considered stepping away from the phone completely, leaving it in another room just to break the cycle of expectation, but I did not move, because even that idea felt like another form of avoidance rather than resolution. Instead, I remained still and allowed my thoughts to continue without interruption, and in that stillness, details from earlier conversations began resurfacing in ways that felt less like memory and more like analysis. Jessica's responses over the past days, the reduced length of her messages, the timing gaps between her replies, the absence of the small informal elements that used to be consistent, all of it began forming a structure in my mind that I could not ignore even if I tried. I opened her contact thread again and scrolled slowly, not searching for anything specific but observing the pattern as a whole, noticing how the tone gradually shifted without any single moment marking the transition. It was not one message or one day that stood out, but the accumulation of many small changes that only became visible when viewed together. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly, realizing that my earlier attempts to rationalize everything had been based on isolated interpretation, while what I was now seeing was something more connected, something that existed only when I stopped separating each detail from the next. The house remained unchanged around me, but my perception of it felt different, as if I was no longer fully inside the same environment I had been in earlier that morning. I checked the time again and noticed how much of the day had passed without any meaningful progression in clarity, only in awareness, and that distinction felt important even though I could not yet explain why. My phone vibrated again briefly, but I did not immediately reach for it this time. Instead, I watched it for a moment, as if observing my own reaction before allowing myself to respond. When I finally picked it up, there was no new information, only the same brief message repeated in slightly different phrasing, still stating that she was busy, still offering no additional context. I placed the phone down more deliberately than before and sat in silence, not trying to interpret the message further, because at that point interpretation no longer seemed productive. What remained was the recognition that I was no longer reacting to individual moments in isolation, but to a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss, and that awareness alone was beginning to change how I understood everything that came before it. I was no longer trying to convince myself that everything had a simple explanation, because by now the pattern had become too consistent to ignore, even without a single moment that clearly defined it. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone still resting in front of me, but my attention was no longer focused on waiting for new messages. Instead, I found myself studying what had already happened, replaying each interaction with Jessica as if I were reviewing a sequence of events that only made sense when viewed as a whole. The silence in the house had shifted. Again, not becoming louder or quieter, but more present, as if it had taken on structure of its own. I noticed how I was no longer reacting emotionally to each individual message, but instead responding to the space between them, and that space was beginning to feel like the most important part of everything. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, and opened her message thread once more, scrolling slowly without expectation of finding anything new, yet still unable to stop myself from looking. Each line felt familiar now, not because of repetition, but because of recognition, as if I was finally seeing the shape of something that had been forming gradually over time. The phrase, "I am busy," no longer felt like a single response, but like a consistent boundary that separated me from whatever was happening on the other side of it. I considered calling her again, not out of urgency, but out of a need to confirm whether my interpretation matched reality, but I did not act on it immediately. Instead, I sat back and allowed the thought to remain unresolved, observing how quickly my mind now filled in gaps that were not explicitly explained. Outside the window, the light had shifted again, signaling the approach of evening, and the change in atmosphere inside the house felt more noticeable than before. I realized that I was no longer simply waiting for communication, I was waiting for clarity, and those two things were not the same anymore. My phone remained still, but my awareness of it had increased, as if its silence itself had become a form of information. I thought back to earlier moments in the week, trying to identify when this shift had started, but there was no single point I could isolate, only a gradual accumulation of differences that only made sense in retrospect. Jessica's presence in my thoughts was no longer tied to specific conversations, but to the absence of continuity between them. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window again, not expecting anything to change, but needing to break the stillness of sitting too long with my own thoughts. The street outside looked unchanged, ordinary in every visible way, yet I could no longer separate what I saw from what I was beginning to interpret beneath it. When I returned to the table, I did not pick up the phone immediately. Instead, I let it sit there while I focused on the realization that the uncertainty I had been resisting was no longer isolated to individual moments, but had expanded into something continuous, something that now defined the way I was experiencing everything around me. I did not move from the table for a long time after that, not because I was waiting for anything specific to happen, but because I had reached a point where even movement felt like it needed justification. The house around me had settled into its evening state, with softer light coming through the windows and longer shadows stretching across the floor, yet none of it felt familiar in the way it used to. I noticed how my attention kept returning to the same object without conscious decision, the phone sitting directly in front of me as if it had become the center of all possible outcomes without actually changing in any way. There were no new messages, no calls, no additional explanations, only the same absence repeating itself in different forms depending on how long I looked at it. I realized I was no longer interpreting events individually, but instead interpreting the structure they were forming together, and that structure no longer felt random. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let my thoughts move without resistance, noticing how quickly my mind now grouped small details into larger patterns, even when I tried not to. The silence in the house had changed again, not in volume but in meaning, as if it was no longer just background but part of the process of observation itself. I stood up slowly and walked into the living room, not searching for anything in particular, but needing to change physical space in order to interrupt the mental loop that had formed. The couch where Jessica and I used to sit together in the evenings felt different now, not because it had changed, but because my perception of shared spaces had shifted. I sat down for a moment and looked at the wall across from me, noticing how ordinary everything still appeared when viewed without emotional expectation. My phone vibrated again briefly from the table behind me, and I did not immediately respond, which was new compared to how I had been reacting earlier in the day. When I finally returned to it, there was still nothing different, only another short message repeating the same explanation, and that repetition itself had started to feel more significant than the content. I read it once, then placed the phone back down, this time without the same sense of urgency I had felt before. I found myself thinking less about what Jessica was doing and more about what was missing from what I was being told, and that shift in focus changed the way I understood the entire situation. I walked back toward the kitchen and paused in the doorway, realizing that I was no longer trying to fill in gaps with assumptions, but instead recognizing the existence of those gaps as a consistent pattern. The house remained unchanged, but my experience of it had become structured around absence rather than presence, and that realization carried a weight that I had not yet fully defined. I stood there quietly, not waiting for anything to happen, but understanding that nothing needed to happen for the situation to continue developing in my mind. I stayed standing in the doorway for a long moment without moving, not because I was waiting for something to happen, but because I no longer understood what moving forward was supposed to look like after realizing how much of my reality had quietly shifted without me noticing it. Evening had fully settled into the house now, washing the walls and furniture in a dim gray softness that made everything feel distant, almost detached from time itself, and the silence surrounding me no longer felt peaceful but observant, as if the entire space had become aware of something I was only beginning to understand. From where I stood, I could still see my phone resting on the kitchen table exactly where I had left it, motionless, dark, ordinary, and yet somehow carrying more emotional weight than anything else in the room. I walked back toward it slowly and lowered myself into the chair again, not because I wanted to read Jessica's message another time, but because sitting down felt like the only action that still carried any sense of stability. For several minutes I did nothing except stare at the room around me, noticing how painfully normal everything still looked, how the kitchen counters remained clean, how the faint hum of the refrigerator continued uninterrupted, how the clock on the wall moved forward with complete indifference to the collapse happening quietly inside my head. That contrast between the ordinary environment and the internal fracture growing beneath my thoughts made everything feel sharper, more difficult to escape, because nothing outside reflected the shift I could now feel shaping itself into certainty within me. Eventually I picked up the phone again and opened Jessica's message, reading the same short explanation that had already repeated itself enough times to lose any emotional tone it once carried. There was no new information left to extract from it, no hidden detail waiting to reveal itself, yet I kept reading because repetition itself had become meaningful. The message was no longer functioning as communication but as structure, a carefully maintained surface designed to remain consistent regardless of how many times I examined it. I realized then that I was not searching for proof anymore. Proof was no longer the issue. What unsettled me was the growing recognition that the consistency of the explanation mattered more than the explanation itself, because people repeat rehearsed truths differently than they repeat rehearsed lies. I set the phone back down and leaned into the chair, staring upward at the ceiling while trying to separate observation from interpretation, but the boundary between them had become impossible to locate. Every detail now connected itself automatically to a larger pattern I could no longer pretend not to see. I thought about earlier months when communication between us had once felt effortless and natural, when silence never required analysis and delayed replies never carried emotional weight, when hearing from her had been ordinary instead of something that now felt calculated through timing, tone, and absence. The distance between those memories and the present moment no longer felt like normal change. It felt gradual, intentional, like consistency itself had been quietly removed piece by piece until uncertainty became the permanent condition underneath everything. I stood up again and walked slowly through the house, moving from room to room without purpose, trying to understand why familiar spaces suddenly felt disconnected from the life I thought existed inside them. The living room still held the same furniture, the hallway still carried the faint scent of her perfume from earlier that morning, the bedroom remained untouched exactly as we had left it, and yet every object now seemed to belong to a version of reality that had already ended without announcing its conclusion. It was unsettling how physical spaces could remain identical while emotionally becoming unrecognizable. I stopped briefly near the window and looked out at the darkening street where headlights passed in silence beyond the glass, each car continuing somewhere specific while I remained trapped inside a moment that refused to fully define itself. Part of me wanted certainty, even painful certainty, because certainty at least creates direction, but what I was experiencing instead was something slower and more psychologically exhausting. It was the accumulation of inconsistencies too small to confront individually yet impossible to ignore collectively. A message here. A silence there. A sudden shift in tone. An explanation arriving too quickly. A distance appearing without discussion. None of it alone strong enough to accuse, but together forming a structure so complete that denying it required more effort than accepting it. When I returned to the kitchen, I placed my phone face down on the counter, not dramatically, not out of anger, but because I finally understood that staring at it longer would not change anything already becoming clear inside me. The realization taking shape was no longer connected to one unanswered question or one suspicious moment. It was connected to the pattern itself, to the quiet repetition of emotional displacement that had slowly replaced trust with interpretation over time. I stood there in complete silence, not reacting outwardly, not waiting for another message, not searching for reassurance, simply recognizing with an almost frightening calm that the uncertainty I had been resisting for weeks had already transformed into something organized, something structured enough to reshape the meaning of everything that had come before it, and once that structure becomes visible, it becomes impossible to return to the comfort of not seeing it.